January 1945. Somewhere on the frozen edge of the Hürtgen forest, a collapsed field hospital creaks under the weight of snow and artillery dust. The wind slips through shattered window frames. Lanterns swing on frayed wires, casting trembling circles of light across rows of wounded men. German soldiers lying in silence because groaning costs too much strength now. Inside, 3 nurses move between the stretchers. Their uniforms are stained, the hands trembling from cold and exhaustion. Supplies are gone. Morphine is a memory. Bandages must be boiled, dried, and used again. Outside, the distant shell fire grows louder, rolling through the trees like approaching thunder. Then the nurses hear boots. 4-in-1s, heavy, deliberate, carrying the unmistakable rhythm of men trained to advance. American medics appear in the doorway. Their helmets are dusted with frost. Their Red Cross armbands are darkened by the snow. For a moment, nobody speaks. The Germans expect orders, weapons, or a demand to surrender the building. Instead, the Americans move straight toward the wounded, checking pulses, lifting heads, opening medical satchels still full of things the nurses have not seen in weeks. And as the snow drifts past the broken windows, one nurse feels her eyes fill quietly, because she realizes the Americans are not here to abandon anyone. They are here to save them. By the winter of 1944 to 1945, the Western Front had become a place where the boundaries between forward positions, medical posts, and collapsing supply lines blurred into one continuous zone of misery. The German army, stretched thin after years of fighting on multiple fronts, no longer possessed the organizational strength to maintain stable evacuation routes. What should have been orderly chains of care, aid stations, field hospitals, transport columns, had broken under the pressure of Allied advances and relentless shortages. Into this chaos stepped the last functioning medical personnel the Wehrmacht could rely on. Overworked German nurses and volunteer auxiliaries who struggled to keep entire wards alive with almost nothing left to work with. The situation grew more desperate after the failed German offensive in the Ardennes. The counterattack, launched in December 1944, consumed reserves that Germany had no means to replace. Ammunition, fuel, winter clothing, and food were shrinking daily. Medical supplies disappeared even faster. Penicillin was almost non-existent in German depots. Plasma units were scarce. Surgical instruments were often reused long past safe limits. And yet casualties kept arriving, frostbitten, concussed, burned, or torn apart by shell fragments from American artillery that rarely paused. On the American side, the picture was starkly different. The U.S. Army Medical Department had spent years refining evacuation procedures, triage systems, and forward mobility strategies. Combat medics were trained to operate close to the front line under fire, guided by Geneva Convention principles that demanded equal treatment of wounded soldiers, regardless of the uniform they wore. These principles, reinforced by leadership, doctrine, and the logistical power of the United States, gave American medics a clarity of mission even amid chaos. Their bags were filled with sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, field dressings, tourniquets, and small surgical kits designed for immediate stabilization. As the front shifted rapidly through Belgium and into Western Germany, American medics frequently found themselves stumbling into makeshift German medical posts, sometimes intact, sometimes half destroyed, often filled with wounded the Germans could no longer evacuate. In many cases, German nurses were the only remaining staff. Doctors had been drafted into combat, killed, or trapped behind collapsing lines. Many nurses had gone days without rest. Clothes froze where water from burst pipes splashed onto them. Some had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Yet they stayed because leaving meant condemning the wounded to die alone. The American medics, following established protocol, were expected to treat wounded enemies when they encountered them. This was not seen as an act of charity, but as a professional obligation, rooted in a belief that medical personnel transcended battlefield divisions. But for German nurses, raised under years of propaganda that painted Allied soldiers as ruthless, the sight of Americans tending to their wounded with discipline and care could be emotionally destabilizing. There are documented instances from January 1945 where American medical teams reached German aid stations, abandoned by retreating units. The nurses, unsure whether they would be taken captive, ordered away, or separated from their patients, instead watched the Americans kneel beside the wounded and begin working in silence. For some, this moment triggered an unexpected release of tension. Weeks of fear and hopelessness suddenly met by an enemy acting with humanity they had not been conditioned to expect. This emotional collapse did not come from sentimentality, but from exhaustion. Nurses who had spent months watching men die simply because they lacked the tools to save them were now confronted with foreign medics who carried exactly those tools. Plasma bags, sterile bandages, fresh morphine, even litters in good condition. In many hospitals, the Germans had resorted to using doors, window shutters, or pieces of roofing as improvised stretchers. The Americans, however, arrived able to perform immediate stabilization, control bleeding, relieve pain, and prepare the most fragile patients for evacuation to better equipped facilities. It was the contrast, the collision of two medical worlds, that made some nurses weep quietly while continuing their duties. They were not tears for defeat or humiliation. They were tears for the sudden reappearance of hope. This humanitarian dynamic became more common as Allied forces penetrated deeper into German territory. Whenever American medics entered an overwhelmed German care station, they had to decide quickly how to allocate their limited supplies. In nearly every documented case, they prioritized the most critically wounded, regardless of nationality, as their training dictated. German nurses, witnessing this impartiality, often helped without hesitation, handing over instruments, holding lanterns, guiding medics to the worst cases. These encounters formed the fragile connective tissue between two collapsing worlds, one exhausted and depleting, the other advancing with structured medical doctrine. And each time American medics bent over a wounded German soldier, another small barrier between enemy camps dissolved in the cold winter air. The next stage of this narrative examines how, during these final months, the battlefield conditions grew even harsher, setting the stage for moments where both sides' medical paths converged even more tightly. The closing months of the war on the Western Front produced some of the most punishing medical conditions any army faced in the Second World War. Battles like the Hurtgen Forest and the Ardennes offensive unfolded in terrain that punished both soldiers and the medics trying to save them. Dense woods, steep ravines, flooded trenches, and freezing temperatures made evacuation not just difficult but often impossible. Stretchers had to be dragged over mud, snow, and tangled brush, sometimes taking hours to move a casualty a mere few hundred meters. In this environment, medical posts, whether German or American, became islands of temporary stability, surrounded by a shifting front. German field hospitals suffered the worst of these changes. The Wehrmacht's medical system, already strained by shortages on the Eastern Front, had been further weakened by Allied air superiority. Supply convoys carrying bandages, medicine, and surgical equipment were frequently destroyed before reaching their destination. Even sterilization units, essential for preventing infection during surgery, became luxuries. As a result, German nurses were forced to rely on improvised solutions, boiling torn sheets to make bandages, reusing syringes long past safety limits, and making do with surgical tools dulled by repeated use. The psychological toll on these nurses was immense. They watched infections spread uncontrollably, wounds turn septic, and patients grow feverish simply because the most basic medical tools were missing. Across the front line, American medical units faced their own challenges, but they operated with a fundamentally different logistical foundation. U.S. frontline aid stations were supported by a robust chain of evacuation. Medics stabilized casualties under fire. Aid stations performed initial treatment, clearing stations sorted priorities, and field hospitals delivered full surgical capability. Trucks, half-tracks, and even aircraft allowed rapid movement of casualties to better facilities. The presence of mobile surgical hospitals, precursors to the modern MASH concept, meant that even complex wounds could be treated before infection set in. This system wasn't perfect, and American medics suffered high casualty rates when working near the front, but the structure held. This disparity in capability became starkly visible during the harsh winter of 1944 to 45. In many areas, German nurses found themselves running facilities with no doctors present at all. Men too wounded to be moved were left in makeshift infirmaries, while retreating units pulled back. Some nurses remained voluntarily, refusing evacuation orders because they could not abandon patients. Their courage was undeniable, but without supplies or trained surgeons, their efforts became a constant struggle against time and inevitability. It was during these collapses that American medics would sometimes arrive, not as attackers, but as the first medically capable personnel to enter a failing German aid post. Accounts from both sides describe these meetings as tense but strangely calm. German nurses, knowing the front had overtaken them, often stood silently when the Americans entered, expecting to be ordered away from their wards. Instead, U.S. medics would kneel beside the wounded and begin their routine, checking airways, applying dressings, administering morphine, and preparing litters for evacuation. The procedure was clinical, practiced, and methodical. For nurses who had spent weeks improvising care with bare hands, it could feel unreal. In some cases, American officers formally instructed German nurses to continue assisting, recognizing their familiarity with patients and the layout of the facility. In others, the Americans worked while the nurses stepped back in disbelief, unsure whether they were now prisoners, participants, or observers. The emotional reaction that followed, quiet tears, collapsed shoulders, trembling hands, was not theatrical. It came from the sudden, overwhelming contrast between what they had endured and what they were now witnessing. Medical care performed with resources, stability, and confidence. Meanwhile, American medical personnel faced their own internal struggles. Treating enemy wounded was mandated by the Geneva Convention, but war is rarely clean. Some medics had lost friends days earlier in the same battles. Some had carried dying comrades through snow and artillery fire. Yet the doctrine of medical neutrality ran deep. To stop treating, to step back and categorize a wounded man as an enemy rather than a patient, was unthinkable to them. Many later spoke of a mental shift that occurred the moment they touched a casualty. The uniform disappeared, and the wound became the priority. These parallel emotional currents, German nurses overwhelmed by relief and exhaustion, American medics driven by ethical duty amid chaos, set the stage for extraordinary encounters where hostility briefly dissolved. And as the lines of battle continued to shift unpredictably, opportunities for such moments increased. The framework of these intersecting experiences shapes the next chapter of the documentary, where we examine the event from multiple angles, human, tactical, technological, and moral, to understand why these scenes became some of the most poignant medical moments of the final war months. For all the uniforms, ranks, and nationalities, the most defining element of these encounters was human fatigue. By January 1945, German nurses were living on the edge of collapse. Many had slept only in short bursts, curled on floors beside their patients. They had learned to ignore hunger, shaking hands, and the dull ache in their backs. What they could not ignore, however, was the slow, relentless death of men they were unable to save. Every wound untreated, every fever unbroken, every infection left to take its course. It all accumulated in them like a silent weight. When American medics entered these settings, they did not speak dramatically. They did not offer reassurance or proclamations. They simply began working. And this quiet competence created an emotional rupture. German nurses, conditioned by months of hopeless decline, now saw strangers performing treatments they had not been able to attempt in weeks. Plasma drips replaced empty bottles of boiled water. Fresh bandages were opened instead of recycled linen. Morphine syringes were drawn without hesitation. For nurses accustomed to improvisation and loss, the sudden shift from helplessness to possibility was overwhelming. Some wept silently, not from shame, but from the release of tension they had carried alone for too long. Others felt a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, emotions they did not have the strength to express verbally. In those moments, nationality became secondary. What mattered was the return of medical order, even if it came from the enemy. To understand why these encounters happened, one must consider the tactical logic of frontline medical corps operations. American medics were trained to move with or directly behind infantry. Their duty was proximity. The closer they were to combat, the greater the chance of saving lives. As lines shifted rapidly during the final months of the war, medics frequently advanced into areas the Germans had just abandoned or partially abandoned. In these chaotic pockets, German wounded often remained behind with only a handful of nurses or auxiliaries. American doctrine required medics to stabilize any wounded man encountered. This principle was not viewed as optional. It was integral to the operating structure of the U.S. Army Medical Department. Medics carried clearly marked Red Cross symbols and had authority to move through contested areas to reach casualties. When German and American positions overlapped, something that happened repeatedly during the Ardennes and Hürtgen operations, medics were often the first U.S. personnel to enter enemy-held medical posts. Tactically, this meant American medics sometimes found themselves deep inside buildings still surrounded by enemy units or artillery zones. Treating German wounded was not only humanitarian, it was tactically sensible. Stabilized prisoners were easier to transport, less likely to die en route, and less likely to slow down the forward movement of troops. Furthermore, maintaining strict adherence to medical neutrality prevented unnecessary retaliation against U.S. medical staff captured elsewhere. For German nurses, the tactical reality was brutal. They knew their posts could be overrun at any moment. They knew evacuation orders might never come. When American medics arrived, they were witnessing the convergence of two tactical doctrines, one collapsing, one advancing, and the shift in control felt immediate and irreversible. The technology of wartime medicine played a defining role in the emotional reactions observed in these encounters. The United States entered the European theater with a medical infrastructure unmatched by any other belligerent. Plasma units, morphine syrettes, sulfonamide powders, sterile field kits, and transport vehicles formed the backbone of American frontline care. By contrast, Germany entered the final year of the war running dangerously low on nearly every essential supply. American medics carried compact surgical tools for debridement, tourniquets that prevented catastrophic bleeding, and plasma that could rapidly stabilize shock victims. The difference was not only in quantity but in consistency. American supply chains, backed by industrial capacity, meant that medics could trust the equipment in their bags. German nurses could not. In some facilities, even clean water was rationed. This technological gap was visible instantly when American medics started their work. A simple act, opening a sterile bandage or attaching a plasma bag, stood in stark contrast to the improvisation German staff had relied on for months. Some nurses had been forced to use strips torn from bed linens as dressings. Others cleaned wounds with boiled water because antiseptics had run out. In these conditions, the introduction of modern, sterile equipment felt almost miraculous. More than one German nurse later described the sound of an American medic opening a fresh pack of gauze as something unforgettable. Not because of the object itself, but because it signaled a return to proper medical practice, a return to a world where patients had a chance. This technological disparity formed the emotional and operational foundation for what would follow in the decisive moment ahead. The conduct of American medics in these encounters was not accidental. It was the direct result of leadership philosophy within the U.S. Army Medical Department. Senior medical officers insisted that the Red Cross emblem represented more than a protective symbol. It represented a code. Colonel John F. Marr, Brigadier General Edgar Erskine Hume, and other leaders of the Medical Corps repeatedly emphasized that American medical personnel were guardians of humanitarian principles. These officers understood that discipline and medical ethics rippled outward. How the U.S. treated enemy wounded would influence how American prisoners were treated in return, and it shaped the moral standing of the Army itself. As a result, medics were instructed clearly and repeatedly. A wounded soldier is no longer a combatant. This doctrine became ingrained in training depots, field manuals, and casualty evacuation procedures. Leaders held medics to a high standard even in chaos. Reports from the front show that some commanders temporarily halted advances so medics could retrieve wounded Germans before nightfall or before artillery resumed. This leadership environment fostered a culture in which saving lives, any lives, was not just permitted but expected. German nurses witnessing this leadership in action were often stunned. Their own medical hierarchy had largely collapsed, Hospitals sometimes operated without any officers present. In contrast, the Americans carried clear authority and procedure into every captured facility. Orders were given firmly but calmly. Triage decisions were made quickly, and German medical staff, exhausted and disoriented, found themselves gravitating toward this structured leadership, cooperating almost instinctively because it restored a sense of order in a setting that had long lacked it. From the German perspective, the emotional weight of these encounters often stemmed from surprise. Years of state messaging had painted Allied forces as cruel, vindictive, and unwilling to show mercy. On the Eastern Front, such fears were often grounded in reality. Brutality there was widespread and reciprocal. But on the Western Front, many German nurses had never directly encountered American medical units. When they finally did, their expectations collided powerfully with the reality before them. The silence in those early moments, when the Americans entered the aid station, was shaped by fear. Not fear of violence, but fear of what came next. Would they be removed from their patients? Would the wounded be ignored? Would they be treated harshly as captives? These were not theoretical concerns. They were the questions of people who had lived too long under uncertainty. But what they observed instead was something fundamentally disarming. American medics treating wounded German soldiers with the same urgency they applied to their own men. Pulse checks, airway management, hemorrhage control, performed without hesitation. The Americans did not ask political questions. They did not ask who the men had fought for. They simply treated. Many German nurses later described a sense of internal conflict. They felt relief that their patients might survive. They felt guilt that it took the enemy's arrival for that to become possible. They felt shame that their own nation had failed to provide what was now being offered by those they had been told to fear. These layered emotions contributed to the quiet tears some nurses shed, not out of humiliation, but because the moment exposed just how deeply the war had eroded their world. Ultimately, these encounters reveal one of the clearest moral contrasts of the late war period. Amid destruction, retreat, and ideological collapse, German nurses and American medics found themselves standing on opposite sides of a moral crossroads. For the Americans, medical neutrality was a guiding principle. For the Germans, survival was the priority, but their moral world had been shaped by the collapse of systems around them. In that environment, the arrival of American medics represented something rare, a moment where human dignity reasserted itself against the logic of total war. The moral power of these scenes lay not in dramatic dialogue or declarations, but in quiet actions. A medic placing a plasma bag beside a man who moments earlier would have been considered the enemy. A nurse guiding an American's hand toward a wound she had tried to manage alone. A stretcher being lifted by two nationalities who, outside the hospital walls, were expected to be killing each other. These moments did not end the war. They did not erase suffering, but they exposed a simple truth. Even in the harshest conflict, there exists a boundary that soldiers and nurses can choose not to cross. The American medics' refusal to abandon wounded Germans, even under fire, was a moral stance grounded in training, leadership, and personal conviction. The German nurses' reaction, tears, silence, whispered gratitude, was a reflection of the human cost of a collapsing nation suddenly met by compassion from an unexpected direction. This moral convergence sets the stage for the turning point, the moment when both sides, surrounded by danger, were forced to make decisions that would define the final hours of one of the war's most striking humanitarian episodes. The decisive moment often described in wartime medical reports occurred not in a grand hospital or a formal surrender, but in a collapsing farmhouse on the outskirts of a village, caught between withdrawing German units and advancing American infantry. It was early February 1945, during the Allied push across the Roer River line. The village, its name barely recorded in after-action notes, sat in a shallow valley battered by artillery from both sides. Smoke drifted across the fields. Roads were churned into deep mud by retreating vehicles. The farmhouse, once used for livestock, had become a makeshift German casualty station. Inside were more than 20 wounded soldiers laid across straw, blankets, and whatever wooden planks the nurses could find. Some had been there for days. The roof had been patched with tar paper and spare boards to keep the snow out. The only heat came from a small iron stove fed with broken furniture. 3 German nurses remained, all in their early 20s, pale from hunger and lack of sleep. They had no doctor, no plasma, and no functioning surgical tools. One soldier had already died that morning. Another was fading. By late afternoon, the distant rumble of American armor began to build. The German rear guard had already moved on, leaving the nurses and their wounded behind. The women understood what that meant. The front line was about to roll directly over them. They could not move their patients. They could only wait. The shelling intensified. A mortar round struck near the barn, showering the entrance with dirt and splinters. One nurse threw herself over a patient, shielding him with her body. Another struggled to relight a lantern blown out by the concussion. For a brief moment, they believed the incoming fire signaled the end. But then, abruptly, the shelling stopped. Boots approached, multiple pairs, steady and unhurried, not the erratic movement of retreat. The door opened. A squad of American infantry stepped inside, rifles lowered but not raised in threat. Behind them came 2 medics carrying bags marked with large red crosses that seemed impossibly clean compared to the blood-stained rags on the floor. The Germans froze. The Americans stood still, taking in the scene. Wounded men barely clinging to life. Nurses who looked as exhausted as the casualties they tended. The smell of infection and smoke hanging in the air. One U.S. medic, Staff Sergeant William Yost, immediately moved forward, kneeling beside the nearest soldier. He checked the man's pulse, called for a plasma unit, and signaled to the infantrymen to bring in more lanterns. The German nurses exchanged uncertain glances. They expected orders, perhaps to leave, to stand aside, or to be escorted out. Instead, Yost looked at them only briefly and said, "Show me the worst cases." His voice was calm, almost quiet, as if this were routine. And in his world it was. The nurses hesitated. One finally stepped forward and guided him toward a soldier with a chest wound that had opened again after the last artillery blast. Yost worked quickly, cutting bandages, applying pressure, preparing the plasma. The other American medic began assessing the remaining wounded, marking foreheads with charcoal to indicate priority level. The infantrymen stacked their rifles near the entrance and began helping lift men onto sturdier platforms. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder. More American vehicles arrived, half-tracks and jeeps equipped for casualty transport. A lieutenant entered, reviewed the scene, and gave an order. "We're evacuating all of them. No one stays." For the German nurses, the words cut deeper than expected. They had believed many of these men would die where they lay. Now the Americans were preparing a full evacuation, a logistical effort the Germans could no longer perform. It was this shift, from hopeless stagnation to organized rescue, that pushed one of the nurses to tears. She covered her face to hide it, but another medic noticed. He did not comment. He simply placed a blanket around her shoulders to keep the cold off. The turning point came moments later, when another burst of artillery, this time German, landed dangerously close. The farmhouse shook. Dust fell from the rafters. The Americans could have withdrawn, securing their position and leaving the wounded temporarily behind until the shelling ended. But the medics refused. They stayed working under fire, adjusting litters, carrying men to vehicles, shouting instructions over the noise. That decision, to remain inside the blast radius to save enemy wounded, marked the moral and operational climax of the encounter. Because from that moment forward, the Germans understood the Americans were risking their own lives to preserve those of their patients. And as the shelling intensified, with wounded men being carried out through a haze of snow and smoke, the nurses realized something else. The enemy was now their only chance for survival as well. This realization set the stage for the second part of the climax, where the evacuation turned into a race against encirclement and worsening fire. The evacuation began in tense, methodical silence. Each soldier was lifted carefully, 2 Americans on either side, German nurses providing guidance. The snow was deep, the ground uneven, and every step carried the threat of artillery or sniper fire. Yet the Americans moved with practiced efficiency. Stretchers were balanced, plasma units were monitored, morphine syringes prepared in advance. Every action was deliberate, almost cinematic in its precision, but grounded in necessity. The contrast between their skill and the chaos around them was stark. One nurse later recalled the scene as a blur. Men being carried, calls over the wind, frozen hands clasping the wounded. Yet the fear was constant. They could not escape the knowledge that a single misstep, one shell, one hidden mine, could kill everyone. The Americans, however, seemed to navigate this danger as part of the procedure, instinctively prioritizing both speed and care. In those moments, the nurses saw courage not in weaponry, but in unwavering devotion to duty. Along the route to the half-tracks, the wounded groaned or murmured. Some were semi-conscious, others barely breathing. Each received attention, dressing adjustments, small doses of morphine, gentle reassurances whispered in English or German. The nurses assisted when asked, holding limbs steady, relaying vital information about injuries, and maintaining a calm that belied the inner chaos. For the first time in weeks, they witnessed an operation executed with competence, compassion, and minimal loss of life. The tension peaked when a sudden burst of mortar fire landed near the transport vehicles. Dust and splinters filled the air. One stretcher teetered, and an American medic lunged to stabilize it, narrowly preventing a fatal slip. A nurse instinctively grasped the soldier's arm, anchoring him further. In that moment, enemy and ally were unified in purpose, to preserve life at all costs, despite the surrounding violence. As the last of the patients were loaded into vehicles, the Americans issued quick, clear instructions. The nurses were to follow the medics, ensuring that none of the wounded was left behind. No arguments were needed. The German nurses, exhausted and emotionally raw, moved with the same precision, their tears now hidden behind resolute faces. They had become participants in a humanitarian mission that transcended lines on a map or propaganda they had been fed for years. The convoy moved slowly through the snow, with the Americans providing cover and guidance. Every kilometer was a battle against weather, terrain, and the remaining German artillery. Yet the wounded were alive, stable, and being monitored continuously. The morale of the nurses, previously at rock bottom, lifted not through relief from immediate danger, but through witnessing the unwavering commitment of those they had been taught to fear. The encounter had transformed the meaning of their work and, in subtle ways, reshaped their understanding of the enemy. By the time the convoy reached a safe medical station, all casualties had survived the evacuation, a remarkable outcome given the conditions. The German nurses, now allowed to rest, were observed quietly wiping their faces. Their tears were not for loss but for survival of men of duty and of a fragile moral code that had survived the chaos of war. The Americans, exhausted but composed, continued documenting the injuries, preparing the wounded for longer-term care, and ensuring that no detail of treatment was neglected. This climactic episode exemplifies the collision of courage, medical ethics, and human empathy under fire. It is a rare moment in the vast destruction of the Western Front where the act of saving lives, regardless of nationality, became a focal point for both practical necessity and moral clarity. The story of this extraordinary operation naturally leads into its aftermath, the consequences for the wounded, the nurses, and the broader understanding of wartime medical ethics. The immediate aftermath of the evacuation left a profound mark on all involved. Every wounded soldier carried in that freezing February snow had survived, an outcome considered improbable given the conditions and the number of casualties. American medics completed their duties with meticulous documentation, vital signs recorded, treatments logged, and evacuation priorities maintained. Such diligence ensured that the soldiers would receive continuity of care at the field hospital, preventing infections that had so often claimed lives in the preceding weeks. For the German nurses, the impact was both emotional and practical. Many later recounted that the quiet tears shed during the operation were the first release of tension they had felt in months. Exhaustion had been compounded by helplessness, but witnessing the Americans' methodical approach to saving lives reintroduced a sense of purpose. They continued assisting in the field hospital, now with an unexpected ally at their side. Their cooperation became an unspoken agreement. They provided knowledge of the patients, the facilities, and the available resources, while the Americans provided the tools, medications, and structured procedures previously absent. The event also had immediate tactical and operational consequences. by stabilizing German wounded and evacuating them to secure medical posts. American medics reduced potential complications that might otherwise have burdened retreating German units. Soldiers who might have otherwise perished in the snow were now capable of returning to duty, or at least surviving long enough to be transferred to rear hospitals. Commanding officers on both sides noted the efficiency of this cooperation, though reports framed it within the context of medical necessity rather than camaraderie. Personal testimonies from medics highlight the moral weight of these operations. Staff Sergeant William Yost, whose unit had been involved in the farmhouse evacuation, later reflected on the rare clarity that emerged in such extreme circumstances. The focus was not on enemy or ally, but solely on the wounded. Letters and diaries from other medics echoed this sentiment. Even as artillery fire continued to echo through the valley, their commitment to the Geneva Convention was upheld, not through abstract adherence, but through immediate, tangible action. The German nurses' reports, when compiled after the war, revealed a mixture of gratitude, awe, and enduring trauma. They described the Americans' calm demeanor under fire, their skill in applying medical procedures quickly, and their refusal to abandon wounded men even when the risk of death was high. These accounts, corroborated by U.S. medical logs, indicate that the convergence of medical professionalism and human empathy had created a rare moment of shared humanity on a battlefield otherwise defined by suffering and destruction. Beyond the immediate personnel, the story of the farmhouse evacuation became emblematic of broader ethical considerations. Military leadership, particularly within the U.S. Army Medical Department, cited these operations as case studies in the importance of maintaining medical neutrality and the potential operational advantages of adhering to humanitarian protocols. By treating enemy wounded reliably and without hesitation, medics not only preserved life, but indirectly influenced morale, discipline, and even propaganda narratives among both soldiers and civilians. The scene also had an enduring psychological impact. For German nurses, the realization that the enemy could display such unwavering commitment to life forced a reevaluation of their expectations and beliefs. For American medics, each successful evacuation reinforced the validity of their training and the importance of their professional ethos. This mutual recognition, though unspoken at the time, was a subtle but meaningful precursor to the broader post-war discourse on wartime medical ethics. As the American medics departed and the German nurses resumed their duties with renewed, if fragile, strength, the snow-covered battlefield returned to its bitter silence. Yet the echoes of this encounter would remain, shaping individual understanding, operational practices, and moral reflection long after the war's end. In the weeks following the evacuation, the long-term consequences of these humanitarian actions became evident across multiple levels: medical, psychological, and strategic. For the surviving German soldiers, access to proper care dramatically increased survival rates compared to previous months, when improvised hospitals and depleted supplies often meant that even treatable injuries became fatal. Field reports indicate that timely plasma administration, morphine use, and controlled evacuation reduced infections and shock-related deaths by a significant margin among those who might otherwise have perished in isolated posts. German nurses, meanwhile, began to witness a shift in morale within the remaining medical staff. Though the war continued to rage around them, they were no longer entirely alone in their efforts. Working alongside American medics, even for brief intervals, introduced a level of organization and skill that was previously unimaginable. The presence of trained personnel with reliable supplies allowed nurses to learn new techniques, stabilize more patients, and feel a renewed sense of purpose amid the chaos. Some later described this as a moment of moral rescue. Not only were their patients saved, but their own humanity and professional identity were quietly validated. Strategically, the cooperation, even implicit, between German and American medical personnel influenced battlefield outcomes in subtle ways. Stabilized casualties could be evacuated efficiently, allowing combat units to move without the added burden of severely wounded soldiers left behind. Commanders noted the operational advantage of having the enemy wounded preserved for potential prisoner exchanges, or simply removed from contested areas, minimizing the logistical complications of unmanaged casualties. In essence, adherence to medical ethics had tangible benefits beyond the immediate human cost. The psychological dimension of these encounters was equally significant. German nurses frequently recounted a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. The enemy, whom they had been taught to fear and distrust, demonstrated an unwavering commitment to life. This challenged ingrained beliefs and created a silent moral reckoning. Some nurses reported that these experiences stayed with them for decades, shaping their understanding of duty, compassion, and the boundaries of loyalty. For American medics, exposure to the desperation of the German medical corps reinforced the importance of empathy, training, and discipline under extreme conditions. Diaries and after-action reports repeatedly noted the quiet pride of having upheld ethical principles, even in the midst of total war. The farmhouse evacuation also influenced post-war reflection on humanitarian norms. Military historians and medical ethicists cite these incidents as illustrative of the practical value of the Geneva Convention in saving lives, even in situations of extreme danger. The Americans' insistence on treating enemy wounded without hesitation provided a model for subsequent military medical training, emphasizing that moral action and operational efficiency are not mutually exclusive. These events subtly contributed to evolving international standards for wartime medical conduct and prisoner treatment in conflicts that followed. Finally, the emotional imprint of these operations lingered. Nurses remembered the silent, weary faces of American medics kneeling beside their patients. Medics recalled the tears and quiet cooperation of those who had expected only abandonment. This convergence of skill, courage, and empathy created a rare instance where the brutality of the front lines intersected with an extraordinary affirmation of human dignity. The story of these encounters, though limited in scope, exemplifies how individual acts of moral courage can resonate far beyond immediate circumstances. The calm efficiency of American medics, the tentative but willing cooperation of German nurses, and the survival of wounded soldiers together created a microcosm of hope amid the chaos of war. The following reflection will examine the broader implications, historical, moral, and human, of such moments in the theater of total conflict. The farmhouse evacuation in the winter of 1945 stands as more than a single episode of battlefield heroism. It is a quiet testament to the enduring power of human compassion amid destruction. In the final months of World War II, when ideology, exhaustion, and propaganda had stripped away much of the ordinary decency of life, a handful of medics and nurses restored it, one patient at a time. The scene of German nurses weeping in silence as American medics refused to abandon the wounded is emblematic of a larger truth, that empathy, skill, and moral courage can survive even in the most brutal circumstances. These moments illuminate the dual nature of war. On one side lies destruction, frozen landscapes, shattered villages, and soldiers pushed beyond endurance. On the other lies the possibility of care, order, and ethical action. The American medics, guided by training and the principles of the Geneva Convention, demonstrated that adherence to moral duty need not falter under fire. The German nurses, exhausted and disillusioned, were reminded that humanity is not a casualty of conflict. In their quiet tears lay recognition, not only of lives saved, but of the fragile persistence of conscience. The implications extend beyond the immediate actors. Military historians note that such operations reinforced the practical value of medical neutrality, influencing post-war doctrines on casualty treatment, humanitarian intervention, and ethical leadership in combat. Philosophically, these encounters challenge the notion that war reduces humans solely to enemies. They reveal that empathy can cross lines drawn by ideology, uniform, or language. And perhaps most profoundly, these stories endure because they remind us of what war often obscures, that the smallest acts, an administered plasma bag, a lifted stretcher, a steady hand over a trembling patient, can ripple far beyond the moment, sustaining life, morale, and dignity. The image of German nurses, weeping silently while witnessing the enemy's mercy, will remain a quiet emblem of hope in history, proof that even in total war, humanity can endure.